Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our last legal series webinar of 2019. This is our sixth and final webinar for this year. My name is Lori Levy. I am your General Counsel and Vice President of Legal Affairs for the Texas Realtors. And I'm really excited for this webinar today. We have personnel from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, here today to talk about flood insurance and flood hazards. We have been working with FEMA closely for the past few months. We began meeting in early 2019 and have come together to bring you all, our members, much more information on flood issues, flood hazards. Today we're going to talk about seller's disclosure issues with floods. It's been a really great relationship that we're very excited about, and we will continue that on through 2020 and beyond. FEMA staff were at our Texas Realtors Conference in September in Fort Worth. They participated in leading a continuing education course and were present at our expo at a booth to help answer questions for our members about flood issues. So we are very excited to host FEMA today, and I know that you all will get a lot out of this presentation. We will post the audio and the slides later today on texasrealestate.com under our webinars. And I do believe we're taking questions at the end of the webinar if there is time permitting. So we will monitor questions that you enter into the system online. So thank you for that, and with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I will introduce Gilbert Carone, FEMA Region 6 Regional Flood Insurance Liaison. Gilbert has worked in floodplain management for FEMA since 2015. He's helped ensure communities maintained all the requirements needed to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, deployed to several major disasters, including Hurricane Harvey and recently Tropical Storm Imelda, and serves as the NFIP flood insurance expert for a 5-state region. He has served 8 years with the United States Marine Corps and returned to the civilian world as a federal law enforcement officer. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree in emergency and disaster management from American Military University, a master's in public administration from the American Public University System, and the certified floodplain manager designation. Gilbert has 3 kids. His family enjoys the outdoors, a little camping, fishing, and hiking any chance they get. I'm a little jealous of that. They are a family of sports enthusiasts from weekly gymnastics to youth football. They stay engaged and very busy. Gilbert recently purchased a wood pellet smoker and is experimenting on how to make Texas barbecue, and I'm sure we'll all be invited over for barbecue in the very near future. With that, Gilbert, we turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having us. It's an honor and privilege to be here with real estate professionals. It's been one of the markets we have been trying to foster relationships with for quite a while. A little bit about this disclosures. We're going to go into some technical details, and if there are questions, let's hold them until the end where I'll be able to answer them one-on-one. With that being said, though, if you have any questions over a specific piece of property, that'll probably be best suited by email, where we can respond to it at a time that's convenient for both you and for our staff. So moving forward, just a couple of facts. Approximately 80% of Hurricane Harvey damaged properties did not have flood insurance, and 65% of those homes were not in a high-risk flood zones. There's a couple of key elements there. Is that 65% of those homes were not in a high-risk flood zone. I want to start off by saying that most people are not aware of this, but the entire country is actually a flood zone. There's just areas of higher risk. What that fun fact right there is stating is that houses that have been zoned outside of FEMA identified special flood hazard areas, or what we also refer to as areas of minimal flooding, have actually flooded. Moving on, just 1 inch of water can cause up to $25,000 to your home. Modern construction is great. These houses go up quickly. However, it's also very easy to damage. The $25,000 does not include the time needed to actually conduct repairs. You just can't rip off the sheetrock, remove the insulation, and start repairing. You have to wait for all that to dry. You have to clean it. You have to disinfect it to prevent mold going. So on top of that $25,000 of damage, you also have time associated with that. Now this is a big one. The average FEMA disaster grant is about $5,000 per household, and the average flood insurance claim payout is about $50,000. What that means is if there's a disaster area and people are not insured, FEMA just doesn't offer assistance. We provide what's called disaster assistance, and that can be anywhere between, as we see here, $5,000, but it can go up to as high as $34,900. But on average, it's $5,000. Now that is for health and sanitary. That's to ensure that you have food in front of you, a roof over your head. It's not necessarily meant to rebuild your home. But as you can see, the average flood insurance claim out was $50,000. You can conduct a lot more repairs to your home with $50,000 than with $5,000. And here's a little bit of information about Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey received $6,000 for the FEMA Disaster Assistance Grant, which was about above average. And as you can see, the average claim payout was about $116,000. That's a significant amount of money to help rebuild. Now, in order to understand the new disclosures that are in that have been passed this past September, we have to understand some terminology. And the disclosures, fortunately, have encompassed a lot of FEMA terminology. So let's go over a little bit of that to make sure that they're understanding. The definitions in FEMA rule are very important to us. In fact, we have the 44 Code of Federal Regulations, 60.3 and 59.1. Don't really pertain to this, but 59.1 are a list of definitions. And the reason why definitions and understandings are always important is that way it avoids miscommunications or different interpretations of what words mean. Our definitions are pretty clear and understandable, and I want to make sure that the participants have a clear understanding. So 1% annual chance of flood. A flood that statistically has a 1% chance of occurring every given year. Referred to as a 100-year flood. Well, we stopped using the 100-year flood because it caused confusion. We were told that a lot of people thought that meant that their homes or this area will flood only once every 100 years. As we know, as from the definition, it can happen any given year. So we started using the term 1% annual chance of flood. We believe that clarified that the confusion and provided better insight. You look there, 26% of flooding over the life of 30 years. You have more percentage of flooding than you do have a house fire. That's something to keep in mind because your homeowner's insurance is going to cover you in case of a fire. But flood is a single peril that has to be purchased separately. So if you have a more likely chance of flooding, you should make sure that your clients are insured for that peril as well. Moving on, we got the 0.2% annual chance of flood. It's also normally referred to as the 500 a year. The difference on this one is not a regulatory aspect when it comes to special flood hazard areas. And we're going to touch on that in just a little bit more in a couple of slides. But just remember, there's still a higher risk of flooding, but it's not enough to be considered in the regulatory aspects when it comes to ordinances for local communities. As you see there, you have a 6% chance of flooding over the life of your 30-year mortgage. Now, floodplain. Describe land areas in terms of its risks of flooding for floodplain management and insurance purposes. This is important for us. FEMA creates what we call special flood hazard areas, and those are identified by special maps called flood insurance rate maps. Now, these flood insurance rate maps have two purposes. The first and foremost is to determine how much flood insurance is to be charged in those areas. The second purpose is to identify some flood risks. And that's a little bit tricky to understand that our maps are actually not identifying the full hazards of risk dangers. We simply cannot afford that type of engineering to go into that much detail. So our flood insurance rate maps are used to determine what the flood insurance would cost in those areas and also identify flood risk up to an extent. And that's really important, as I said before, as the entire country is a floodplain. Just certain areas of higher risk, you have your lower, your moderate, and your higher risk. As we move down, we see the flood insurance rate map of the geographical representation of the special flood hazard area. The special flood hazard area is, right now, it's very simple. It's a line on a map. Either you're in or you're out based on that line. In reality, we do know piece of on a line on a piece of paper is not going to actually stop water in real life. But that's the way our maps work right now. There are some, believe it or not, there are some communities in Texas, I believe we have over 130 that still have not been mapped. But those are often found in areas that have very little to no flooding history and very little to no development and population growth as well. So floodplain and flood insurance rate maps are very important for you to know, especially on the new disclosure requirements. Moving forward, we're going to talk a little about flood zones. The special flood hazard area is land area covered by the flood of the base flood. The special flood hazard area is where the community enforces local ordinances that meet or exceeds the National Flood Insurance Program's minimal floodplain management standards. We also use the special flood hazard areas for mandatory purchase requirements. That's if a homeowner is using any type of federally backed mortgage, a mandatory purchase of flood insurance comes into play. Now, the special flood hazard area is also a FEMA minimum criteria. You may have some communities, and this is important to know, that have adopted higher standards. Higher standards, well, let me step back 1 second. FEMA requires all communities to adopt and enforce FEMA minimum floodplain management criteria. And then you have some communities, larger cities, for example, Houston, who have taken those minimum standards, deemed them not sufficient, and have added higher standards to encompass, for example, the 0.2% floodplain as to be treated as regulatory, and all the requirements in the special flood hazard area therefore must be met. We encourage communities to adopt these higher standards. They know their risk more than our engineers who create these mapping products, who are often in headquarters or in different regions. So higher standards are a great thing. Now we're talking about non-special flood hazard areas. Now this is an area of moderate to low risk. It's considered to have a 0.2% chance of your flood, what we used to call the 500 year. And the structures in the non-special flood hazard area are still a risk. It's important to remember that even those in an area of minimal flooding can still flood. As we've seen, 65% of those from Harvey were outside of the floodplain when they fled. Now, floodway, we start to get some technical terms here. It's a channel or river or other water course adjacent land and must be reserved in order to discharge the base flood without cumulatively increasing the water surface elevation more than a designated height. Besides coastal, floodway is the most restrictive flood zone we have identified at FEMA. Houses that were built in floodways before they were floodways are there. There's nothing can be done about that. But if new development takes place in floodways, it's a very slippery slope. They have to prove that there is a 0.0 rise, and the only way to prove that is by engineering, hydraulic hydrology reports. And if that report does show that there is a rise, in order for the development to take place, engineering has to be done to reduce that back to a 0.0 rise. So it's important to remember, if you come across any of your clients put down floodways, make sure you understand what is needed and necessary for those type of developments. Now, floodways are treated just like a regular standard special flood hazard area when it comes to flood insurance. You can still purchase it, and it's still going to be at the rates based on individual variables of homes. So let's talk a little bit about the firm panels. We talked about the flood insurance rate maps and how they're primarily used to determine how much our flood insurance costs, and also identify flood risks. So we have a trying to use a pointer, but you'll see the Zone A, areas of the 1% annual chance of flooding, 26% chance of flooding over a lifetime of 30 years. The Zone A's are kind of unique. We know that they are areas of flooding and they're prone to flood, but they do not warrant an in-depth analysis, so therefore we don't have detailed information such as base flood elevations for Zone A's. Now that makes things kind of complicated when we're talking about flood insurance and compliance. Because in compliance world, any new development, new constructions, or any houses that have been deemed substantially damaged or substantially improved have to meet the ordinance, which require them to be built to base flood elevation or higher. Well, how do you do that when there's not a base flood elevation determined? Well, that falls on the community to provide a community-determined base flood elevation, or homeowners to hire a surveyor or engineer to determine the base flood elevations for them. This used to be a very complex scenario in the past, but nowadays we have new technology, we have new methods such as base level engineering, which are great tools for not only city or community officials, but also real estate professionals, insurance professionals, to get a better understanding of what the base flood elevation is for homes or structures located in Zone A's. Now, Zone A1 through A30, these are numbered zones. This term is old. We no longer use those, but since we still have maps that have them identified on them, we have to maintain them. But these used to be what is now called the AE zones with BFEs identified. So just be aware of that. If you do have the requirement to look up a map on the Map Service Center or the Map Exchange, and you see those numbers A1 through A30, those are old firms that do show a base flood elevation based on that criteria. But what you will most likely see nowadays are something very similar to this diagram here. As you can see, it's very busy. It looks very complicated, but it's actually quite simple. Any map that you have, that you receive from FEMA, or you look at, will have a legend. That legend is very clear and it's very informative. Here we have an AE zone, which is clearly identified in the center of the diagram. And when you see the solid lines going down there with the AU and AV, those are called cross sections. That means that there's detailed study for this area. That means we have good information, which is very important for homeowners. And the more information you have on floodplain, the better they can make informed decisions. So in this particular case, you also see that little squiggly line with the number 730 circled in red. Well, that's the base flood elevation for that particular area. Now, 730 might seem high, but that's going to be 730 based on sea level. When surveys are done, elevation certificates, which are documents needed in the floodplain rule, are provided. All that is broken down to where it's understandable at the local community level. For example, that 730 could break down to a base elevation of about 15, depending on the zone or risk. But that's what you'll see most likely, and we even have those now in digital format, so it's even easier to understand and read. Zone AH, this one is a little bit complicated. As you can see by the diagram there, it's kind of an area of shallow flooding. It usually forms with an average depth of 1 to 3 feet. Well, it's really hard to do a base flood elevation on AH zones. So what we do is, if you look at the map, directly under the zone AH, where it's in parentheses elevation 4, that's where the requirements are going to be. It's going to be 4 feet above the grade in that area for development or compliance. Now, these areas can be engineered to remove the AH from the floodplain, and communities often apply for grants through FEMA to help this. As you can see from the diagram, we have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 streets that would have been impacted by AH zones, which would have a negative impact on flood insurance premiums. But by engineering or floodplain management control methods, that could possibly be removed from the special flood hazard area, reducing the impact of flood insurance premiums on those homeowners. Now we have kind of the opposite impact when we talk about zones AO. This is more of sheet flowing. We see this in kind of riverine type flooding when we have an average flow going across. Once again, it's hard to determine a base flood elevation in this area, so we go off of depth. In this particular diagram, you'll see there we have the zone AO identified by the red circle, and in parentheses we have the depth of 2 feet. So that's a minimum of 2 feet development there. So any houses that were built in that area for new construction would have to have a minimum of 2 feet above that grade, and then incorporate any higher standards the community may have. So it could be as high as 3 to 4 feet above that grade elevation. And as you can see, there's also a 20% chance of flooding over the life of a 30-year mortgage with this one as well. Zones AR, this might impact some areas along the coast. With a temporary increase of flood risk, the building or restoration of a flood control system such as levee or dam. Mandatory flood insurance purchase requirements will apply but not exceed the rates for unnumbered A zones. So AR means that there is a flood control measure being built or restored. In case of levees, maybe they lost their certification and they need to have some maintenance done before they're recertified by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Once they're certified, it changes the dynamics when it comes to flood insurance. But until it is certified or those flood control measures are complete and approved, the flood rates or the flood insurance premiums will be equivalent to an unnumbered A zone. Now dropping down to zone A99, areas with the 1% annual chance of flooding that are protected by a federal control system. This is primarily used for levees. If you are in a special flood hazard area and you are now protected by a certified levee or dam, you'll be treated as a X zone protected by levee. This will impact your flood insurance premium for a positive. It will reduce the costs, and also same thing for compliance, but it doesn't reduce the risk. And just keep in mind, if that levee system fails or other requirements needed for that levee system, such as pumps, fail, it could have an impact on the flooding as well. All right, let's talk about coastal zones. The diagram on the left, the top part, is, I think this is the best diagram you could ever have. It shows several aspects of how floodplain management compliance coincides with flood insurance. So the V is coastal zones. And as I mentioned before, the only thing more restricted than floodway is coastal. And rightfully so. I mean, not only are you dealing with flooding, but you're also talking about surge and velocity coming in off the coast, and you're also talking about wind when you start to build higher than what you would see inland. So in the coastal, we have a wave height of plus 3 feet. And then we have that imaginary line, and it breaks down to A zone. That's when waves crest under 3 feet. And then once again, you see another line, and that's X. And don't forget, X is area minimum flooding. So we go from one of the most restrictive to a moderate to a area minimal flooding. But as you can see, the house there is protected. It's protected several ways. It's elevated. You see the 100-year still elevation right there. That is what the base elevation needs to be. But when you take the wave effects in, you'll see that blue line above, how much that increases. So without that house being properly elevated, there is no doubt that if it was a slab-on-grade foundation, the house would have been inundated with water and suffered catastrophic flood damages. So taking that in consideration, we require all houses in coastals to be elevated. In fact, slab-on-grade foundations are not allowed in coastal V zones. And communities will put their participation in NFIP in jeopardy if they do allow those. So coastal VE zones they're the exact same thing. We have VE. Really the difference is when you look at the diagram to the left, we start seeing the diagonal lines. We start breaking down to COBRAs. Coastal Barrier Resources Act or system. It was established back in the early 1990s as a way to protect large areas of wetlands, swamps, bayous. At that time, if you had a structure that was in place there, flood insurance is still available for you. But now, if you wanted to build there, you would have to build at your own peril. Federally backed mortgages will not be available, or nor would any type of flood insurance product from the NFIP. You may be able to pursue private product, but not under the NFIP. So let's talk about the flood zones in the X area. Flood zone shaded, an area of moderate flood risk, usually the area between the limits of 1% and 0.2% annual chance of flood. This is also known as a 500-year. This is what I was mentioning earlier, is not the regulatory aspect unless it's specifically adopted by the community as a higher standard in the ordinance. And you can normally tell by the shaded X. It's a very light shaded as compared to the dark shaded special flood hazard area. So you can clearly identify the diagram to the left, the circled zone X, as a light gray section. That is the zone X shaded. And then when you look to the right of that diagram, you see the dark shaded. That is the special flood hazard area. So zone X, area of minimal flooding. It is usually depicted on firms as about a 0.2% annual chance of flood. Now this diagram is very important to me because I want you to understand that according to this diagram, that line is where the risk stops. But in reality, we know the truth. We know that water is not going to stop just because there's a line on that piece of paper. So that zone X is completely surrounded by known special flood hazard area. There's still a very good chance with the right amount of rainfall or even other sources that X can also flood. Now we have zone Ds. Well, we normally don't see a whole lot of zone Ds outside of military bases, but those are areas that have been undetermined flood risk hazards. With that being said is that there's possibility of flood risk, there just hasn't been the reason to actually map them. Anytime that FEMA does a map, it's a very expensive process, and it can take up to 3 to 5 years from the discovery phase all the way up to the final maps being given to their community. And we're talking about millions upon millions of dollars for mapping areas. So if it's not absolutely needed, we won't map those. And zone Ds, since most times they are wide open areas, area of low population, low development, we'll just leave them as is. But however, since there is the undetermined risk, the flood insurance premiums will actually reflect that as well. Now, this is a great resource for anyone. It doesn't matter if you're a real estate professional, insurance professional, even homeowners. It's the FEMA Map Service Center, and this, my understanding is these slides will be available, so these links will also be available for you as well. You can just do an open search, Google, Bing, anything you want, and put in FEMA Map Service Center, and this will populate. Once this is up, if you look down to the left, about the middle of the screen, you say enter an address, place, or coordinate. If you were to put in your address or any address that you have questions about, it will populate on that where that diagram is, and the address will be indicated by that red dot with the black circle. Now this is great. Now we have to understand satellite imagery. It's going to be plus or minus, anywhere between 20 to 50 feet. So it should get you pretty close to the area in question. And it's going to give you a good idea if it's close to a special flood hazard area or not. Here, as you can see in the diagram with the address inputted, that we are actually close to a zone AE, right across from the reservoir, that Barker's Reservoir. So we know there that you're outside the special flood hazard area, but you're still close enough to be at risk. You can also look at the rest of that diagram. It looks kind of busy. We have some shaded, we have some dark blue. Once again, the legend on the bottom of that is going to indicate all that you'll need to know to understand everything that's on this map. We also have some regulatory floodway, which means we have detailed study, and if we zoom in close enough, we'll be able to find the base flood elevation for some of these locations. But the thing to remember about the base flood elevations found on the firms is that everything is rounded up. So when there's detailed studies and you hire your clients hire surveyors to go get information, you want to make sure that they use information based off a flood insurance study. And surveyors should be well versed on this, community officials should be well versed on this. If you have access to best available information, and in this case it is a flood insurance study, it is only prudent that that be used. In fact, I have in my prior role in compliance, floodplain administrators often approach me on which one they need to accept if they have the elevation certificate based on firm or FIS. My response was if they had a FIS on available, I would return the elevation certificate as being filled out incomplete and returned. Now this is another great tool. This is the National Flood Hazard Layer. This is an incredible tool. This is an unofficial ferment, and what I mean by that is when you use the Map Service Center, you can create a ferment document, which is a legal document used to identify your house. It can't be used for letter or map changes or some other technical terms, but it can be used for some things. But the National Flood Hazard Layer is for your visibility only. But it's a great tool because you can actually zoom in, and it's digitized. Some of the map service centers, some of the older areas have not been digitized. So the National Flood Hazard Layer has a little bit more in-depth and is more advanced than the map service center. This is one of those tools that you'll have to play with. Once again, the address, if you look at the middle of the page, you'll see find address or place. If you type in that address there, the box that opens up, there's two squares. One's white, one's red. Actually, the white one will have an arrow or something similar. You click that, and you're able to pinpoint a location and hit execute. And then it will come up with a bunch of information for you. It'll tell you the flood zone. It'll tell you to confirm the address. A lot of good information. And you can also create a permit. And it's a little bit better of a one-page document. And it provides just a wealth of information for everyone to understand. So as real estate professionals, these will be great tools to provide to your clients if they are just simply unaware of the risk in the areas of the structures are located. Okay, so interested in learning more about firms, additional resources are included in the appendix. We'll go over that here in a minute. But now we discussed a lot of the terminology that is going to be asked for in the seller disclosure. So now we're going to move on to page 3, 6, 7, and 8 of the legal disclosure forms. We'll jump right into question 6. Are you, the seller, aware of any of the following conditions? Now, I do know that the burden to fill out this disclosure falls on the homeowner. But as professionals in your field, it's nice to understand what is being asked and be able to provide information to your clients so they can fill it out as correctly as possible. So the question is, are you, the seller, aware of any of the following conditions? Present flood insurance coverage. Now, we understand homeowners insurance is different, and flood insurance is a single peril policy, so it has to be purchased separately. Now, most cases for houses outside of special flood hazard areas, they are eligible for what's called a preferred risk policy. Now, that is the lowest of the low in the flood insurance world in the NFIP. That means they haven't had any prior flood losses. They are in an area of minimal flooding. The advantages of a preferred risk policy is that it combines both the building coverage and the content coverage into one policy, and on average is about $550 a year for statutory limits of $250,000 building and $100,000 content. So that's a large amount of coverage for $550 a year. If the seller has grandfathered the rate, the policy rate can be transferred to the new owner. That is important to understand. If you do have a client that is attempting to sell and they have an existing flood insurance policy through the NFIP, that can be transferred to the new owners. It has to be done at closing. That'll also carry over any type of grandfathering or subsidies that are in place. So that needs to be identified as well. And standard flood insurance policy or group flood insurance policy, owner receives, yeah. So what we're saying here is a standard flood insurance policy or a group flood insurance policy is that may have meant that that current homeowner has received disaster assistance at one time or another. And that's important because if you receive disaster assistance, there's an obligation to obtain and maintain flood insurance for as long as the home is there, not the homeowner. And that's something to remember in the flood insurance world and compliance as well. The owner of the home isn't necessarily as important to us as the condition of the house and compliance of the house. So if one homeowner received disaster assistance and that obligation to obtain and maintain is there, that requirement will transfer over to the new homeowner. So that's also important on why we need to have that in disclosure. No waiting period if you purchase flood insurance in connection with making a loan or increasing, extending, or renewing your mortgage loan. That's important as well. It's the same as if you're able to roll over an existing flood insurance policy. on average, if you come in as a new business in the flood insurance market for the NFIP, there's a 30-day mandatory wait. We learned our lesson before. We had people in the Midwest flood back in the early 80s buy flood insurance the week knowing that upriver was flooding. And sure enough, when their houses were flooded later on that week, they received full payout, but only paid one month of flood insurance premiums. So it's really hard. There are very few exceptions for that 30-day wait, but these are a couple of them. Okay, question 6. Continued. Previous flooding due to failure or breach or reservoir or controlled emergency release water from a reservoir. Okay. So the seller can request a flood insurance history from the current owner, and that's highly encouraged. FEMA being FEMA, we will only release flood loss history to the current owner. And I have a phone number I'm going to provide to the council here, and they'll be able to send out to all the members for a homeowner to call and to get the instructions and how to request the flood loss history. It will take a couple weeks, and you will receive it in the mail, but it will be on a FEMA official letterhead, and it will go over the entire flood loss history of that home. So that'll be from the original construction date till current. That's very important. That could be a good selling feature if they can show that there's no flood loss history. And it's the property close to reservoir, dam, or levee. As you can tell, we do have times, for example, 899, a levee, special flood hazard area that's protected by levee is going to resort back to an X. But that's not always the case. That levee has to maintain certification. There has to be preventive maintenance. It has to be well cared for. If any of those lapse, that could have an impact later on. If they lose their certification, it would resort back to a special flood hazard area. So, very important information to keep aware of. Previous water penetration to the structure of the property due to a natural event. If the buyer is applying for a heavily backed mortgage and the property is in a high-risk area, flood insurance will be required. It's called a mandatory purchase, and it is law. When we first initiated the National Flood Insurance Program back in 1968, we didn't get a lot of participation at first. It wasn't until Congress finally tied in federal mortgage loans to the what's now called mandatory purchase requirement. So any federal mortgage, it doesn't matter if it's Fannie Mae, Fannie Mac, VA, FHA, if federal dollars are used to purchase anything inside of a special flood hazard area, flood insurance is required. Okay, continued, right? Yes, if you're aware, and check wholly on the partly as applicable right now if you are not aware. So we discussed a little bit about the 100-year floodplain. Don't forget the tools that are going to be available at the end of this presentation of the links for the Map Service Center and the National Flood Hazard Layer. Those are going to help you identify. But if there's any question at all, the flood zone or flood risk, you can always contact your local floodplain administrator. If your community is participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, it's a requirement that they have a floodplain administrator or floodplain manager identified. So most of the time they're within their engineering department or public works. They can be in either one of those, but they can answer a lot of these questions. And if you have area communities such as Houston that has a large office, they can even provide detailed maps for you. We discussed the differences between what was called the 100-year floodplain, or the 1%, and the 500-year floodplain, or the 0.2%. The differences involved there is, remember, the 2% is non-regulatory unless the community has adopted it into their higher standards, such as Houston. We've also talked about a floodway. A floodway cannot be changed. It cannot have any type of an increase. So any type of development has to maintain a 0.0 rise. For existing structures, there are some requirements involved. As long as the footprint doesn't change, you may be able to reflect some changes. But the hydraulic and hydrology studies proving that the 0.0 is still the requirement. Now we're moving into flood, pool, and reservoir. The first three aspects of this are FEMA terminology. Flood, pool, and reservoir are not, and I believe we're going to be able to discuss them, and the definitions are found in the disclosure.
Yeah, Gilbert. This is David Jones, Associate Counsel with Texas Realtors. Those last two terms, in a flood pool and in a reservoir, those are from Texas legislature, and the definitions are actually on the seller's disclosure. I believe it's page 3 of Texas Realtors 1406 seller's disclosure. Flood pool means the area adjacent to a reservoir that lies above the normal maximum operating level of the reservoir, and that is subject to controlled inundation under the management of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. A reservoir is defined, it means a water impoundment project operated by the United States Army Corps of Engineers that is intended to retain water or delay the runoff of water in a designated surface area of land. Again, both of those definitions, those are not FEMA definitions, those are for the Texas seller's disclosure, and both definitions, all definitions actually, the 100-year floodplain, the 500-year floodplain, flood pool, flood insurance rate map, floodway, and reservoir are all defined on the actual seller's disclosure.
Thank you, sir. So that's a lot of information to have there, and I'll give you a little secret. If you are inside of a special flood hazard area, there is a document that's a requirement for new construction. It's called an elevation certificate. That right there it will be an incurred cost on the homeowner to have an elevation certificate done. But that elevation certificate is a wealth of information that can help the homeowners make informed decisions, especially when it comes time to determine elevation. In the world of flood insurance, elevation is always going to be key. An elevation certificate is going to show you what the difference in elevation is compared to the basal elevation to the lowest floor of the structure that is being referred to. An elevation certificate can show if it's 3, 4, 5 feet above basal elevation, their flood insurance premium is going to be reduced significantly. So knowing this information can help in the long term. And once again, it provides all the information on here as well, such as the 100-year, the 500-year, and the floodway. So there's another question here. How does the seller determine if the flood zone, if the house is located in 2 zones? That is a great question. And FEMA requires that the most restrictive of the 2 zones. So let's do a hypothetical that we're on the coast, and we have a parcel of land that has part B zone and part coastal A zone, right? So there's 2 zones. So coastal A zones, technically we can allow slab-on grade. But B zones, you cannot allow slab-on grade. So since B zone is more restrictive, you have to build on pier, pylons, and posts. And that's going to be throughout the NFIP. So question 7. Have you ever filed a claim for flood damage to the property with any insurance provider, including the NFIP? This is very important. We do notice that it says any insurance provider. Private sector flood insurance is coming on strong, and we encourage this. NFIP, we know that we can't insure everybody, and sometimes our premiums are higher than some private sectors. We just want people to be protected against the risks of flooding. But we have to, the knowledge of these flood claims have to be made available to customers either buying or selling. It can have an impact moving down the road. What was caused by the national flood event? How high was the flood water? That's imperative. Was sheetrock removed to prevent mold? Buyers can request flood loss history from the seller. But it's also to make an informed decision when it comes to the flood insurance premiums. Like other insurance, when there's an event, FEMA will basically give you the first one as a freebie. It won't impact your flood insurance premiums outside the annual increases to premiums, and all flood insurance premiums will increase over time. But we won't hammer you or go after you for a first-time event. But a second event, that will start to have an impact on your flood insurance premium. In fact, if you have 2 events in any given 10 years, any rolling 10 years, that are over $1,000 or more, could actually impact you as a repetitive loss structure. Now, that's important because as a repetitive loss structure, that means the house is flooded more than twice, more likely to flood again, and the flood insurance is going to increase significantly over the years on that. By knowing how many claims have actually taken place, once again, you're able to make informed decisions on either if this is acceptable property or if the risk is too high for customers who may be looking to buy. It also will help you for the customers who are looking to sell if they are identified as ARL, SRL, on avenues and how to remove that, either by mitigating the house, by elevation, if could be. Maybe they may be eligible for a grant. We have a lot of money still coming in from Hurricane Harvey that can be used for situations like that. Sheetrock removed is important because flood insurance, as most other insurance, will only cover the damages incurred by flooding. We won't cover mold if sheetrock was not removed. There's other variables involved to this as well, but it's important that if a claim was filed, that the money was actually used to fix what was damaged. If there is a secondary claim and our adjusters go out there and determine that the damage was pre-existing from a prior flood event, the claim will be denied. So, very important to know on prior flood loss and prior claims. Question A, have you ever received assistance from FEMA or the U.S. Small Business Administration for home damage or flood damage to the property? As I mentioned before, this is very important. Oops, my apologies. This is very important because if you have received disaster assistance, and if you receive a group flood insurance policy paid for through disaster assistance, you'll have the obligation to obtain and maintain flood insurance throughout the lifetime of that home, not the ownership, but the lifetime of that home. So as long as that home exists, that requirement is there. The thing is, if you do not maintain flood insurance, you will not be eligible for disaster assistance in the next flooding event. It's very imperative to understand that. It's also not used for preliminary damage assessments when it comes time for FEMA to determine if communities have been impacted enough monetarily and damage-wise to initiate a presidentially declared disaster. And if seller has had a GFIP policy, the answer should be yes to this question. A group flood insurance policy is paid for out of the disaster assistance grant that was removed and bought a flood insurance policy equivalent to about $35,000 that was good for 3 years. After that third year, the homeowner at the time would receive many renewed notifications that the GFIP is set to expire, and the obligation to obtain and maintain falls upon that homeowner and for as long as that structure is in place. So we went over a lot of information fairly quickly. I think we have time for questions, and as we were waiting for any questions that may come in, we can go over the appendix. This is the FEMA map information exchange. Once again, if you have any questions on maps, you can actually click onto the website, and they actually have phone numbers as well where you can speak to a map specialist in regards to specific locations. So keep in mind, it may be better for the actual homeowner to call. We also have links to tutorials on understanding floodplain maps, understanding flood zones, and how to read flood insurance rate maps tutorials. These are great tools. Once again, these disclosure requirements are new, so the more the real estate professionals have an understanding, they can guide clients to make informed decisions. With that, 10 minutes for questions.
I do have a question, Gilbert. Does a municipality determine whether a property can be constructed in a special flood hazard area?
Yes. So the municipality has adopted floodplain ordinance. We call it the FDPO, Flood Damage Preventive Ordinance. And we have this ordinance in place because we can't tell a homeowner they can't develop their land. Even if it's in a special flood hazard area, that would be considered a taking, an eminent domain. and we simply can't do that. But what a community can require is that the development, that new construction, meets certain requirements when it comes to compliance for their ordinance. And most ordinances require the new construction to be built at base elevation or higher. I'm unable to move forward on our presentation, but we also have a couple more slides in the appendix. One of them is the local floodplain administrator. This is very important. I'm really surprised in the number of calls I receive that people don't know that they have a local floodplain administrator whose sole purpose is to answer flood-related questions when it comes to flood insurance or compliance. So you can contact your local city hall or your county offices and ask for the floodplain administrator's office and ask them questions. They are more likely your best avenue for questions when it comes to areas that are maybe in the preliminary status. They have old maps, the new maps are still coming out. They can give you updates on those new maps that may come into place. We saw huge map changes in the Missouri County area, and the floodplain administrators were just invaluable to us in spreading the message on these map changes and how they could impact flood insurance and compliance throughout the communities. So that will be part of it as well, and also local floodplain management ordinance regulations. Those are a great tool to understand, and there's a large number of communities who have their flood damage ordinance or flood damage preventive ordinance online. That will give you a good idea for maybe customers who are looking for parcels to build on what the requirements will be to build inside of the special flood hazard area, because there are going to be requirements to build. And don't forget, it also allows you to understand if the community has higher standards. Once it's adopted into that ordinance, it is a local law, and therefore it is a requirement. So FEMA minimum will only take you to a point. If they have adopted higher standards, such as Houston has 2 foot of freeboard, it'd be FEMA minimum requirement based on elevation plus 2 feet for new construction.
Okay, Gilbert, thank you. I have another question. If a home I have listed has repetitive flood history, can that homeowner request FEMA buyout?
Okay, so we're moving into grants. Now I can answer this one because it's not too technical. Think of FEMA as a checkbook when it comes to the grant process. We give money to the state gives it to the county. The county is working with the communities to make a list of their priorities when it comes to flooding. We do want buyouts to be priority. However, the state and the counties are the ones who determine what priorities the money is to be spent on. It could be flood control measures such as levees, dams, or it could be buyouts, and it could be elevation grants. But ultimately, that homeowner would have to apply for a grant through the county emergency manager, who would then take it up to the state emergency management department for that process.
Okay, thank you. Another question came in. They're asking, please review how to determine if a community or county participates in FEMA zoning.
I think maybe it's that they participate in an FIP.
Can I get some clarification on that question? Is that participates in FEMA National Flood Insurance Program? So let's assume that that does indicate the NFIP. Well, you can always call your community directly, or you can get online and do FEMA Community Status Book. And that Community Status Book will give you a list of every community in the entire country that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. It will give you their status, if they're in good standing or if they're suspended. It'll also give you a list of communities who are not participating.
Thank you. Another question. I heard if you got flooded 3 times, FEMA will not pay after the 3rd time. Is that true?
If you have flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program and you have followed through and maintained flood insurance, you will receive a payout as long as the flood or the damage is caused by a flooding event. If you received, and we'll use a hypothetical here, if you've on your 2nd flooding event and you have not used the claim money to conduct any repairs, you won't receive a third payout. That's totally reflective on the damage and the amount of the claims. As I mentioned before, the elevation certificate is very important. It is an additional cost on the homeowners, but it is so important to have this information at your fingertip. Elevation certificate can be prepared for your property and may be able to maintain for previous or current property owners. So if you are working with someone who is selling in a special flood hazard, ask if they have an existing elevation certificate. If you're working with someone who's buying, ask them to have the seller provide the elevation certificate so you have a clear understanding of the ground truth information.
I don't see any other questions coming in. There is one. We've got a couple of minutes. We're going to see what this one question is. I think that was, it was just addressed.
So if your community has a firm, you are participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. You would not receive a map without it. This is a very specific question about individual property. If you can email me afterwards, I can help you with this.
Are you comfortable sharing your email address?
Yes.
It's in the slides. Do you want to go ahead and say it now as
Yes.
well?
My email address is my first last name, Gilbert.Giron, Giron, at FEMA.dhs.gov. I do ask that you use this presentation and take advantage of the tools available before you email me. But if you do have very specific or complex questions, don't hesitate to email me at all. Elevation certificates do expire. More importantly, the ground truth expires. If you have an elevation certificate that's 10 years old, it may not be acceptable for certain aspects. And as a customer, if you gave me an elevation certificate that's 10 years old, I would ask for a new one.
And with that, we are going to say thank you very much to Gilbert for the presentation today. We really appreciate the partnership with FEMA. We appreciate you being here and putting this information together. These slides are already posted as a PDF on texasrealestate.com. The audio will be uploaded by the end of the day today. As Gilbert said, please feel free to go back to that. Use that information. If you can't find what you need, you can contact Gilbert directly. We thank you very much for today for this information and for your continued availability. This does conclude the final Legal Series webinar of 2019. Look for information coming for our Legal Series webinars that we'll be hosting in 2020. Perhaps we will have FEMA back for one then. I know this is going to be an ongoing discussion, and the more information we can share with our members, the more educated they are and the more they can assist their clients, as you stated in the webinar. So thank you very much. Thank you for all of those who participated. We will see you next time.